The Theosophical Society has for over a century, in fact, moving towards 150 years, strongly influenced many fields of endeavors, science and arts in particular. In its early days, such household names as the Nobel Prize-winning Irish author William Butler Yeats, the Dutch abstract painter Piet Mondrian, and one of the world's most prolific inventors, the American Thomas Alva Edison, were all members of the society. As were prominent English scientists, Sir William Crookes, Alfred Russell, and the French astronomer Camille Flammarion. This talk looks at what attracted the aforementioned and other high-profile figures to join an organization whose motto is, "There is no religion higher than truth." And it examines as well the legacy they left behind, helping us all to live more insightful, productive lives. But first, to put matters into context, it might well be useful to examine a bit of history connected with theosophy, often known interchangeably as the sacred science, the esoteric philosophy, and the wisdom religion. One reads in the Bible, Mark 4, verse 13, the following tract: "Unto you it is given to know the mystery of the kingdom of God, but to them that are without, all these things are done in parables." Since time immemorial, there have been deeper esoteric teachings that have been reserved for selected people. This knowledge persists to this day in its hidden forms, in most religions and cultures. It was known to 3rd century Alexandrian philosophers as Theosophy, which is Greek for divine wisdom, and its members were known as Philalethians. The eclectic Theosophical Society arose from its ranks, beginning with Ammonius Saccas, who wished to demonstrate the identical origin of every caste of religion and to establish a universal creed based on ethics. Ammonius Saccas did not leave behind any writings. However, Plotinus and other of his pupils have left records of the Philalethian system and the eclectic school of theosophy. The modern Theosophical Society, established in 1875 in New York City, was the modern successor to the old eclectic school of theosophy. And in his inaugural address on the 17th of November, as president of the new organization, Henry Steele Olcott told the meeting, "If I correctly understand our public work, it is to aid in freeing the public mind of religious superstition. We are simply investigators of earnest purpose and unbiased mind, who study all things, prove all things, and hold fast to all that which is good." Olcott, who was to remain president until his death in 1907, and he was amongst 3 principal founders, the others being Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, a Russian noblewoman, and William Quan Judge, an Irish lawyer. Described as the Sphinx of the 19th century, Blavatsky was a natural psychic from childhood. She traveled to Egypt and Tibet to develop her paranormal gifts, and for a while was a member of a secret sect, the Druzes of Lebanon. Very much an action woman, Blavatsky fought alongside Garibaldi at the Battle of Mentana in 1867. She was also an accomplished pianist and toured Italy and Russia for a number of years. But it is her writings that have proved to be her greatest legacy. Blavatsky wrote magazine articles and commentaries on a variety of subjects, but she is best known for her writings on such subjects as Isis Unveiled in 1877 and The Secret Doctrine, 1888, both of which are still in print. The former deals with the existence of a wisdom tradition, at that time forgotten in the West. The Secret Doctrine outlines a vast scheme of evolution relating to both the universe and to man, and to the unseen as well as the seen worlds of manifestation, in which life is said to exist in thousands of forms. Blavatsky was clearly well ahead of her times, and a number of predictions concerning molecular science, notably the divisibility of the atom, were corroborated in 20th century laboratories. And it was through the influential writing of HPB, as she was known to her friends, that a number of prominent scientists, writers, painters, musicians, and even a future international president of the society, one Annie Besant, were brought into the theosophical orbit. One of the biggest guns to join the fledgling society was Sir William Crookes, who was born on 17th of June, 1832, and died on the 4th of April, 1919. He was a London-born chemist and physicist who was a pioneer of vacuum tubes, inventing the Crookes tube, which was made in 1875 and is in the illustration you see. This was a foundational discovery that eventually changed the whole of chemistry and physics as well. Wilhelm Röntgen discovered X-rays using the Crookes tube in 1895. With the help of spectroscopy, he is credited with discovering in 1861 the elemental thallium. Additionally, Crookes was the first to describe in 1865 the spectrum of terrestrial helium. And while being the inventor of the radiometer, he was unable accurately to explain the phenomena he detected. Crookes also invented a 100% ultraviolet blocking sunglass lens. His interests were manifold and covered pure and applied science, economic and practical problems, and psychic research, the latter which may well have influenced him to join the Theosophical Society on the 15th of December, 1883, with one Charles Webster Leadbeater. A well-known personality, his many talents earned him a substantial income, and he received many public and academic honors. He was knighted in 1897 and was president of the Royal Society. In the Reader's Guide to the Mahatma Letters to A.P. Sinnett, we read about Crookes the following. He was one of the highest minds whom the adept founders of the TS had hoped to interest in Theosophy. And Blavatsky states, he was teaching a very occult doctrine, and the Mahatmas intended to help him. Crookes was attracted to spiritualism, perhaps drawn to the philosophy, following the premature death at just 21 of his brother Philip in 1867. In 1870, Crookes stated that science had a duty to study in an impartial way the phenomena associated with spiritualism. He studied such well-known mediums as Katie Fox and Florence Cook and claimed to have witnessed many phenomena, including the appearance of ghostly characters such as Katie King. His report in 1874 concluded that these phenomena could not be explained as conjuring and that further research would be useful. In the 1890s, I should say, he joined the Society for Psychical Research and became its president. He was also a member of another paranormal organization, the Ghost Club, and was its president from 1907 to 1912. Another heavyweight scientist to find his way into the hallowed halls of the TS was Alfred Russel Wallace. One of England's greatest scientists, Wallace was born on the 8th of January, 200 years ago, in Llanbadog, Monmouthshire, Wales. He was a man of many talents, a naturalist, explorer, geographer, anthropologist, biologist, and illustrator. And he is famous for simultaneously having formulated with Charles Darwin a theory about the origin of species by natural selection. Wallace was awarded in 1868 the Royal Society's prestigious Royal Medal and was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1893. In 1908, he received the Copley Medal and Order of Merit. His most important work, published in 1870, was Contributions to the Theory of Natural Selection. And in this tome, we read of how he differed from Darwin on the theme of natural selection, contending that, unlike other animals, the appearance of mankind was to a certain extent the result of some non-physical causes. He had an abiding interest in spiritualism and other psychic phenomena, which was developed some years before his investigations on natural selection. In 1875, he published On Miracles and Modern Spiritualism, in which he outlined the rationale for his beliefs. He expanded the teachings of spiritualism in a number of later writings, excerpts which are reproduced below. The universal teaching of modern spiritualism is that the world and the whole material universe exist for the purpose of developing spiritual beings. The death is simply a transition from material existence to the first grade of spirit life, and that our happiness and the degree of our progress will be wholly dependent upon the use we have made of our faculties and opportunities here. In 1876, Wallace joined the Theosophical Society. Henry Steele Olcott, the first president of the TS, was in correspondence with Wallace and sent him a copy of his People from the Other Worlds, which was published in 1875. Olcott's fellow co-founder of the TS, H.P. Blavatsky, also sent Wallace a copy of her recent publication, Isis Unveiled, and in 1878 received the following reply. Dear Madam, I return you many thanks for the handsome present of your 2 very handsome volumes. I am amazed at the vast amount of erudition displayed in them and the great interest of the topics on which they treat. Your book will open up to many spiritualists a whole world of new ideas and cannot fail to be one of the greatest value in the inquiry, which is now being so earnestly carried on. When just 5 years of age, his family moved to Hartford, and then Alfred went on to live in London at 14, where he boarded with his older brother, John. While in the nation's capital, Alfred attended the London Mechanics' Institute, where he was exposed to the radical political ideas of Robert Owen, the Welsh social reformer, and Thomas Paine, the English-born political theorists. Between 1840 and 1843, Wallace worked as a land surveyor in the countryside of the west of England. And following his father's death in 1843, Wallace began working in Leicester at the collegiate school, where he taught drawing, map making, and surveying. It was also here in Leicester that Wallace attended a lecture by Spencer Hall on hypnosis, then known as mesmerism. Wallace then experimented and managed to hypnotize some of his students. And as a result, Wallace concluded there was a link between his experiences with mesmerism and spiritualism. But it was not for another 20 years that Wallace devoted his full energies to investigating spiritualism. He was a regular visitor to the town library, where he read such progressive writings as an essay on the principle of population by Thomas Robert Malthus, a personal narrative by Alexander von Humboldt, and Charles Darwin's journal, the latter which recounted the voyage of the Beagle. And one evening, Wallace met Henry Bates, the entomologist, who at just 19 years of age had published in the journal Zoologist an 1843 paper on beetles. He befriended Wallace and encouraged him to collect insects. Bates and Wallace undertook extensive fieldwork in the Amazon River Basin beginning in 1848. And from 1854 to 1862, Wallace traveled through the Malay archipelago, where he identified the faunal divide, now called the Wallace Line, which separates the Indonesian archipelago into a western portion in which the animals are largely of Asian origin, and an eastern portion where the fauna display Australasian characteristics. Following his return from Malaya in 1865, Wallace began serious studies of spiritualism and became a regular attender at seances. For the rest of his life, he remained convinced that at least some seance phenomena were genuine, despite accusations of fraud and evidence of trickery. Wallace's scientific reputation took a battering as a result of his public advocacy of spiritualism and permanently strained his relationships with Henry Bates, Thomas Huxley, and even Darwin. Sometimes called the father of biogeography, or more accurately of zoogeography, Wallace is often considered the 19th century's leading expert on the geographical distribution of animal species. Through his extensive work in biogeography, he became all too aware of the impact of human activities on the natural world. Far from mellowing with age, Wallace's comments on environment grew more urgent later in his career. In The World of Life, 1911, he wrote that people should view nature as invested with a certain sanctity, to be used by us but not abused, and never to be recklessly destroyed or defaced. And it wasn't just on planet Earth that Wallace focused his scientific mind. His 1904 book, Man's Place in the Universe, he seriously evaluated the likelihood of life on other planets. Along with his fellow theosophist, the astronomer Camille Flammarion, he was one of the first scientists to write comprehensively on the possibility of life on Mars. It's interesting to read that in the 1880s, Wallace joined the debate over the mandatory smallpox vaccination. Always suspicious of authority, Wallace suspected that physicians had a vested interest in promoting vaccination, and he became convinced that reductions in the incidence of smallpox that had been attributed to vaccination were due to better hygiene and improvements in public sanitation. Another factor in Wallace's thinking was his belief that because of the action of natural selection, organisms were in a state of balance with their environment, and that everything in nature, even disease-causing organisms, served a useful purpose. He feared vaccination might upset this balance. Wallace was a social activist, supporting the rights of the downtrodden commoner in Victorian England and campaigning in favor of women's suffrage. He criticized the free trade policies of the UK for the deleterious effects they wreaked on the working class. He was very keen on the utopian novel written by Edward Bellamy, entitled Looking Backward, and after reading it, declared himself a socialist. Another controversial subject doing the rounds in the late 1800s was the concept of eugenics, an idea which found favor with a number of other prominent 19th century evolutionary thinkers. Wallace argued that contemporary society was too corrupt and unjust to allow any reasonable determination of who was fit or unfit. In his 1890 article, Human Selection, he wrote, "Those who succeed in the race for wealth are by no means the best or the most intelligent." Clearly ahead of his times, Wallace put in his oar on the ethics of waging warfare. In an 1899 essay, he stated that all modern wars are dynastic, that they are caused by the ambition, the interests, the jealousies, and the insatiable greed of power of their rulers, or of the great mercantile and financial classes, which have power and influence over their rulers, and that the results of war are never good for the people who yet bear all its burdens. London's Natural History Museum coordinated worldwide events to commemorate the Wallace centenary of his birth in 2013. A portrait of Wallace was unveiled in the main hall of the museum, and Sir David Attenborough unveiled a statue of Wallace at the museum on the 7th of November, the 100th anniversary of his death. The next scientist in our study is the French astronomer Camille Flammarion. He was born on the 26th of February, 1842, and died on the 3rd of June, 1925. He was the author of more than 50 titles, and his writings include popular science works about astronomy, several notable early science fiction novels, and works on psychical research and related topics. He also published the magazine L'Astronomie starting in 1882. He was a founder and first president of the Société Astronomique de France and maintained a private observatory at Juvisy-sur-Orge in Paris. He was strongly influenced by Jean Raymond, who had developed a religious system based on the transmigration of souls, believed to be reconcilable with both Christianity and pluralism. He was convinced that souls, after the physical death, pass from planet to planet and progressively improve at each new incarnation. He was Flammarion became an honorary member of the Theosophical Society in Paris on the 23rd of July, 1890, and he was a member of the General Council of the Society from 1880 for several years. Flammarion considered man to be a citizen of the sky. Other worlds were studios of human work, schools where the expanding soul progressively learns and develops, assimilating gradually the knowledge to which its aspirations tend, approaching thus evermore the end of its destiny. In 1907, somewhat controversially, he wrote in the New York Times that he believed that dwellers on Mars had tried to communicate with the Earth in the past. And as to the notion of the so-called canals put forward by the Italian astronomer Schiaparelli in 1877, Flammarion concluded that the canals were artificial in nature and most likely the rectification of old rivers aimed at the general distribution of water to the surface of the continents. He assumed that the planet Mars was in an advanced stage of its habitability, and that the canals were the product of an intelligent species attempting to survive on a dying world. Flammarion was thought of highly by one of the esotericist H.P. Blavatsky's teachers, Kurt Humi, who writes, "You have amongst the learned members of your society one theosophist who, without familiarity with our occult doctrine, has yet intuitively grasped from scientific data the idea of a solar pralaya, that is to say, an inactive state. And it's Manvantar, or the active state, in their beginnings. I am referring to the celebrated French astronomer Flammarion. He speaks like a true seer. Madame Blavatsky commented on Flammarion's scientific arguments that the conditions necessary for life are present on other planets. Still, the fact remains that most of the planets, as the stars beyond our system, are inhabited, a fact which has been admitted by the men of science themselves. Laplace and Herschel believed it, though they wisely abstained from imprudent speculation, and that the same conclusion has been worked out and supported with an array of scientific considerations by C. Flammarion, the well-known French astronomer. Scientific reasoning as well as observed fact concur with the statements of the seer and the innate voice in man's own heart in declaring that life, intelligent, conscious life, must exist on other worlds than ours. The other major abiding passion of Flammarion was psychical research, but he approached Spiritism, reincarnation, and allied subjects from a scientific viewpoint of writing. He says, "It is by the scientific method alone that we may progress in the search for truth. Religious belief must not take the place of impartial analysis. We must be constantly on our guard against illusions." Flammarion was very close to the French author Allan Kardec, the founder of Spiritism. Flammarion had studied mediumship and wrote, "It is infinitely to be regretted that we cannot trust the loyalty of mediums. They almost always cheat." He did, however, attend seances and believed that some of the phenomena was genuine. And after 2 years' investigation into automatic writing, he wrote that the subconscious mind is the explanation, and there is no evidence for the spirit hypothesis. Flammarion believed in the survival of the soul after death, but wrote that mediumship had not been scientifically proven. And now our focus moves to Thomas Alva Edison, one of the world's most prolific inventors, holding more than 1,000 patents in the US of A alone. Born on the 11th of February, 1847, 176 years ago yesterday in Milan, Ohio, he died on the 17th of October, 1931 in West Orange, New Jersey. Edison developed many devices that greatly influenced life around the world, including the phonograph, the motion picture camera, and a practical, long-lasting light bulb. Early in his career, he worked as a telegraph operator, which inspired many of his early inventions. He established the first industrial research laboratory at Menlo Park, New Jersey, where many of his inventions were developed. In an interview on the 2nd of October, 1910 in the New York Times magazine, Edison stated somewhat controversially, "Nature is what we know. We do not know the gods of religions. And nature is not kind or merciful or loving. If God made me, the fabled God of the three qualities of which I spoke, mercy, kindness, and love, he also made the fish I catch and eat. And where does his mercy, kindness, and love for that fish come in? No, nature made us. Nature did it all, not the gods of the religions." Edison added that he did not believe in the God of the theologians, but said, "There is a supreme intelligence I do not doubt." Edison joined the Theosophical Society on the 4th of April, 1878, as the 162nd person to be admitted. His view of matter was in contrast with the then current scientific ideas of his day, but in accord with theosophical views. And co-founder of the society, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, quotes him in volume 12 of the collected writings on page 130. She says, "I do not believe that matter is inert, acted upon by an outside force. To me, it seems that every atom is possessed by a certain amount of primitive intelligence. Look at the 1,000 ways in which atoms of hydrogen combine with those of other elements. Do you mean to say they do this without intelligence?" In the 1870s, the New York Sun newspaper printed an article by Edison of a new natural force. Blavatsky quoted from the article in volume 1, chapter 5 of Isis Unveiled, and offered her take on what exactly was this force that might be described as astral light. Absurd and unscientific as may appear our comparison of a fictitious vril invented by the great novelist Edward Bulwer Lytton in his novel The Coming Race, and the primal force of the equally great experimentalist with the Kabbalistic astral light, it is nevertheless the true definition of this force. Blavatsky quotes from Edison on the subject of the new natural force in this way: "It is as distinct and has as regular laws as heat, magnetism, or electricity." The journal, which contains the first account of the discovery, adds that Mr. Edison thinks that it exists in connection with heat and that it can also be generated by independent and as yet undiscovered means. Prominent theosophist Alfred Percy Sinnett saw great applications for one of Edison's inventions, the tassometer, which was designed to measure infrared radiation. When attached to a large telescope, he said, the tassometer will afford the possibility not only to measure the heat of the remotest of visible stars, but to detect by their invisible radiations stars that are unseen and otherwise undetectable, hence planets as well. About 50 years later, this prediction became reality with construction of the first radio telescope in 1931. However, Edison was the first scientist on record to have proposed an experiment to detect radio waves as long ago as 1890. Edison has received a number of awards both during his life and posthumously, both in his native USA and abroad. Life magazine, in a special double issue in 1997, placed Edison first in the list of the 100 most important people in the last 1,000 years, noting that the light bulb he promoted lit up the world. One should not underestimate the impact the Theosophical Society has had on the modern world through its writers, painters, and musicians. But perhaps the most influential wordsmith was William Butler Yeats, born on the 13th of June, 1865, and died on the 28th of January, 1939. An Irish poet, dramatist, writer, and one of the foremost figures of 20th century literature, Yeats was awarded the prestigious Nobel Prize in 1923. He was a driving force behind the Irish literary revival. Yeats had a lifelong interest in mysticism, spiritualism, occultism, and astrology. He read extensively on the subjects throughout his life and was greatly influenced by the Theosophical Society and the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg, Jacobum, Paracelsus, as well as Celtic bardic literature and Vedanta. Although Yeats' early works were heavily influenced by Percy Bysshe Shelley, Edmund Spenser, and the pre-Raphaelite poets, he soon turned to Irish mythology and folklore and the writings of William Blake. Later in life, Yeats paid tribute to Blake by describing him as one of the great artificers of God who uttered great truths to a little clan. While in Dublin, Yeats began his theosophical involvement, being admitted as a member of the Theosophical Society on the 12th of March, 1885. In late 1884, his aunt had sent him a copy of Esoteric Buddhism by Alfred Percy Sinnett. Yeats then lent the book to his good friend Charles Johnson, whom he had known since 1881. Originally, he had considered a career in the church, but after reading the book, Johnson forsook that path. Instead, he went to London to interview the founders of the movement, and on his return, introduced Theosophy to Dublin. In 1886, at the TS in Dublin, Yeats met his first Eastern holy man, Mohini Chatterjee, who had traveled from the Theosophical Society in London to lecture. Chatterjee propounded the existentialist principles of samkara, of the need to realize one's individual soul by contemplation, and the illusory nature of the material world. Yeats had the following to say about Mohini's influence. It was my first meeting with a philosophy that confirmed my vague speculations and seemed at once logical and boundless. Consciousness, he taught, does not merely spread out its surface, but has in vision and contemplation another notion and change in height and depth. In 1887, Yeats traveled to London, where he was introduced by Charles Johnston to H.P. Blavatsky, who had only recently arrived in England. During the coming year, he was paying visits to the growing Blavatsky entourage in Holland Park, West London. And in December 1888, he joined the esoteric section of the TS that Blavatsky had recently established. In 1889, he transferred his membership to the Theosophical Society in England. Regularly visiting the British Museum, one day Yeats met MacGregor Mathers, author of the Kabbalah Unveiled, and was invited to join the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Inaugurated in 1888, the organization was devoted to the study and practice of the occult, metaphysics, and paranormal activities. And in its time, it included such luminaries as the aforementioned Sir William Crookes, the playwright Oscar Wilde, and Yeats' fellow Irish writer George William Russell. Yeats was very interested in magic. A fellow visitor with him to Blavatsky's home, the American artist Edmund Russell, said, for Yeats, next to poetry, magic was the most important pursuit of his life. There is little doubt that his meetings with Blavatsky influenced his thinking and his work. He had for many years been convinced of the supernatural and viewed the spirit world as lying behind visions, behind everything. And in 1911, he became a member of the paranormal research organization, the Ghost Club. Yeats had a passionate hope of finding a proof of immortality comprehensible to everybody, which might act as a catalyst for people to change their inner perspective and outer lives radically and fast, thus improving human relations, purifying politics, and spiritualizing art. Few could tread the path of vision, most required a shortcut. Seances might provide the shortcut. Many warned against the pitfalls of pursuing such investigations. Blavatsky was against the practice, saying the danger was black magic. Few dabbling in phenomena were strong enough to avoid hooking up with the lower forces of the Gutya. While Yeats' early poetry drew heavily on Irish myth and folklore, his later work was engaged with more contemporary issues, and his style underwent a dramatic transformation. However, in the final years of his life, Yeats discovered new imaginative inspiration in the mystical system he had developed while under the influence of spirituality. One of the key 20th century English language poets, Yeats was a symbolist poet, using allusive imagery and choosing words and assembling them so that in addition to a particular meaning, they suggest abstract thoughts that may seem more significant and resonant. His symbols usually hint at something that, while physical in nature, may at times point to immaterial, timeless qualities. The name L. Frank Baum is hardly a household name, certainly not in Europe. But the book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, is a classic known the world over. Lyman Frank Baum, 15th of May, 1856 to the 6th of May, 1919, its author and his wife, Maud, were members of the Theosophical Society in America. Baum's mother-in-law, Matilda Joslyn Gage, was an ardent Theosophist, having been admitted to the Rochester, New York branch in 1885. Baum and his wife joined Chicago's Ramayana branch of the TS in 1892. The Wizard of Oz almost wrote itself, as Baum recounted to his publisher in 1900, when he presented the manuscripts to the tome. I was sitting on a hat rack in the hall, telling the kids a story, and suddenly this one moved right in and took possession. I shooed the children away and grabbed a piece of writing paper that was lying there on the rack and began to write. It really seemed to write itself. Then I couldn't find any regular paper, so I took anything at all, each a bunch, even a bunch of old envelopes. Had to have something to write on. The book was an instant success, and its 13 sequels have been reprinted many times, selling millions of copies. The first novel was adapted as a 1902 musical at the Chicago Grand Opera and on Broadway in New York. A film followed in 1939, released to great acclaim. Baum wrote more than 70 books. In 36 of them, he used pseudonyms. And under his editorship of the Aberdeen Saturday Pioneer in 1890, before joining the Society, he wrote the following about Theosophy. Amongst the various sects so numerous in America today who find their fundamental basis in occultism, the Theosophists stand preeminent both in intelligence and point of numbers. Its followers are simply searchers after truth. Not for the ignorant are the tenets they hold, neither for the worldly in any sense. Enrolled within their ranks are some of the grandest intellects of the Eastern and Western worlds. Purity in all things, even to asceticism, is absolutely required to fit them to enter the avenues of knowledge. And the only inducement they offer to neophytes is the privilege of searching for the truth in their company. Peter Cornelis Piet Mondrian, an influential Dutch painter born on the 7th of March, 1872, was one of the founders of the Dutch modern movement De Stijl. At the age of 20, he enrolled at the Academy of Fine Arts in Amsterdam. In 1892, he soon entered the city's artistic circles. And in the same period, he came into contact for the first time with esotericism, notably Theosophy, which led him to turn away from the Calvinist faith in which he was raised. Mondrian was initially employed as a primary school teacher, and at this time painted naturalistic landscapes. His early works display soft, misty colors of the Dutch countryside. But from about 1907, his palette expanded into stronger color schemes. The artist explored several styles: luminism, divisionism, symbolism, and suprematism, but then settled on cubism, as exemplified by Picasso and Braque. During World War I, while staying at an artist colony, he met Theo van Doesburg, with whom he founded the art periodical, De Stijl. Mondrian's form of synthetic cubism displayed a tendency towards full abstraction. He radically simplified the painting's elements to reflect a spiritual order underpinning the visible world, creating a clear and universal narrative in his canvases. De Stijl was an artistic and architectural movement in the Netherlands between 1917 and 1931, in which artists aimed for pure abstraction. Palettes were reduced to just black, white, gray, and primary colors. Mondrian developed his own unique form, which he called neoplasticism, which consisted of horizontal and vertical configurations of squares and rectangles. He was influenced by M.H.J. Schoenemakers, a theosophist and mathematician, who in a 1915 essay wrote, "The two fundamental and absolute extremes that shape our planet are, on the one hand, the line of the horizontal force, namely the trajectory of the Earth around the sun, and on the other, vertical and essentially spatial movement of the rays that issue from the center of the sun. The three essential colors are yellow, blue, and red. There exist no other colors besides these three." It was in Paris after the end of World War I where he began work on the grid-based paintings for which he's best known, using gray or black lines as structures for blocks of white, gray, and primary colors. In 1908, Piet Mondrian became interested in the Theosophical Society, and on the 25th of May, 1909, became a member of the Dutch section. The Society's co-founder, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, believed that it was possible to attain a knowledge of nature more profound than that provided by empirical means. And much of Mondrian's work for the rest of his life was inspired by his search for that spiritual knowledge. In addition to Blavatsky's writing, he is known to have read works by the French philosopher Edouard Schuré and by Rudolf Steiner, General Secretary of the German TS. As Tezel M. Baudouin writes in his article, "Abstract Art as a Byproduct of Astral Manifestation, the Influence of Theosophy on Modern Art in Europe," He says theosophical concepts pervaded Mondrian's development of neoplasticism. He was most concerned with cosmic harmony, which was to be expressed in a correct balance between general and abstract elements, representative of absolute truth and absolute beauty. These elements or vibrations of energy are either male, equated to the vertical and direction, and visually represented by the line, or female, the horizontal and space represented by the field and color. And I would like to just briefly mention a couple of other artists of note before the clock throws me out of the studio. Another abstract artist of note was Jean Deville, who lived between 1867 and 1953. He was a Belgian symbolist painter, author, and teacher, and was the first general secretary of the Theosophical Society in Belgium from 1911 to 1913. He demonstrated great technical skill and originality in his works of art. He developed a style that departed from the naturalistic aestheticism and the materialistic realism of the day. His work was, in a word, idealistic. He joined the TS in the late 1890s after being introduced to the society from an existing member, Edward Schouret. And as a result of this encounter, Delville added a tower to his house in Forest, painting the meditation room at the top entirely in blue, with the theosophical emblem at its summit. In 1899, Delville founded a theosophical journal entitled La Lumière. From 1900 to 1906, he was a professor at the Glasgow School of Art, and afterwards he worked as a professor of drawing at the Académie des Beaux-Arts in Brussels until 1937. In 1908, the Russian composer and pianist Alexander Scriabin relocated to Brussels, and there met Delville. Scriabin had been introduced to Theosophy 3 years earlier. And when Scriabin composed his Fifth Symphony, Prometheus, or the Poem of Fire, in 1909 and 10, Delville created the cover art for the score. He worked in many artistic media: oil, tempera, chalk, pencil, charcoal, and even mosaic. And he experimented with several color schemes and styles, but always focused on the inner reality, the central idea of what he was painting. He writes in La Mission de l'Art of the expressiveness of idealistic art, and he says, before works of genius, the human consciousness receives mental and spiritual vibrations, which are generated by the force of the idea reflected. In 1926, in the Theosophists, the international journal of the Theosophical Society, he published, or the Theosophists published an article by Delville called Modernism in Painting, in which he expressed his views. Art in its human expression is above all things a psychological, a spiritual, an inner phenomena. It is of the imagination, and human imagination is an independent faculty. To produce any work of art, to make manifest a beautiful thing, the artist need not depend on the surroundings in which he lives, neither need he reproduce or imitate the objects of those surroundings or look to them for his inspiration. And finally, when discussing theosophy and art, we cannot, in all fairness, not make at least passing reference to the Canadian Lauren Harris, a well-known landscape painter and founder of Canada's Group of Seven. In 1904, he attended art school in Berlin, where he was exposed to the vast open landscape paintings of Caspar David Friedrich, which stimulated in him a heightened spiritual experience. He also met Paul Thiem, another painter who was a poet, philosopher, and theosophist. When he returned to Canada in 1908, he joined the Arts and Letters Club, where he met Roy Mitchell, then secretary of the Toronto Theosophical Society. And Mitchell introduced Harris to the writings of Helena Blavatsky and Eastern mysticism. In the coming years, Harris formed friendships with some of the cream of Toronto landscape painters who became members of the Group of Seven, exhibiting for the first time in 1920. This group would soon become the most influential collection of painters that Canada has ever known, and many of them were influenced by theosophical concepts. His early works, painted between 1910 and 18, were of urban cityscapes and rural landscapes. From 1920 onward, he concentrated in painting the Canadian landscape, and scenes which started as colorful lyrical interpretations became increasingly abstract with the deepening of Harris's spirituality. His career was of constant exploration. He was the only member of the Group of Seven to align himself with the forms of American and European modernism. And his first abstract pictures date from 1934, emanating out of a desire to express ideas of the spirit. And in an article praising abstraction, he wrote, "We have a creative adventure in harmony with the highest aspiration and search for truth, beauty, and expressive evocation and communication in our own day." Over the years, paintings by Harris have fetched a princely sum, as much as 11 million Canadian dollars for a single painting, for one entitled Mountain Forms in 2016. In his book, Theosophy in Canada, Ted Davey, former General Secretary of the TS in Canada, remarks it was not just with brush and canvas that Harris demonstrated his art and philosophy. And quite controversially, Davey says, unlike his famous contemporaries Kandinsky and Mondrian, whose name are frequently linked with Theosophy, but who appear to have had but a superficial grasp of the subject, Lauren had studied deeply what he referred to as the divine wisdom, and also attempted to live the theosophical life. In 1933, Harris delivered a series of memorable lectures broadcast on Toronto radio, which included such ideas as the oneness of all life, universal brotherhood, karma, and reincarnation, all of which he considered the building blocks of his philosophy. Blavatsky insisted that all of us are responsible for our own spiritual evolution through self-induced and self-devised efforts. This concept was one on which Harris placed much importance. He identifies karma as the operative force in connection with self-responsibility. And we quote, "The law of justice places the entire responsibility for all we do, think, and feel, good, bad, and indifferent, on ourselves." And karma, he said, applies not only to individuals, but to groups and nations, which one might say is very relevant to the present world situation, 90 years on from when these remarks were made. And thus ends our own resume of the explorations taken by scientists in their laboratories, writers in their studios, and painters with their canvases. A common thread of all that has gone before is the sense that we are all aboard a ship in search of truth, faced with endless challenges and obstacles that steer us oh so gradually on our journey to the ultimate goal in the distant future, on a far-off shore where we encounter the state of self-realization and truly in every conceivable way, know thyself. Thank you for your attention.